Shavua Tov, Bruchim Habayim. On behalf of Ivrit BaMerkaz, Hebrew at the Center, I want to welcome you to Sicha, a series of online conversations focused on Hebrew. For those who don't know me, my name is Arnie Winchell, and I am the founding president of Ivrit BaMerkaz. Ivrit BaMerkaz was founded over 10 years ago with the mission to revolutionize the teaching and learning of Hebrew. We chose this focus in service of a vision of a world where Hebrew literacy is vibrant, celebrated, and pivotal to a thriving Jewish identity and global Jewish community. When we set out as a small group of Hebrew language educators and enthusiasts to disrupt the status quo, we envisioned our contribution to this Salon, this dream, would be realized by addressing what has been a lack of success in effectively giving the gift of proficiency in Hebrew to Jews throughout the diaspora. We believe that through a deep investment in our educators and educational system to ensure effective and engaging Hebrew teaching and learning, we will see a Jewish world in which modern Hebrew is not only the language of the state of Israel, Medinat Yisrael, but also the language of Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. As this initial series of 4 programs draws to a close today, we ask that you respond when you receive the survey about the series and provide us with feedback in order for us to plan future programming as we strive to broaden the arc of engagement of a wider audience. We have had over 200 individuals join us thus far. Please share these conversations with others. The recordings are available at our website, hebrewatthecenter.org/sicha, S-I-C-H-A. We hope Sicha has served to strengthen your appreciation for the value of investing in Hebrew, while considering the complexity of the relationship the Jewish people have with Ivrit, with Hebrew. Please join us in our efforts to disrupt the current status quo. Today's program is co-hosted by CASG, the Consortium for Applied Studies in Jewish Education. And we welcome Dr. Ariel Levitas, CASG Managing Director, who will join us to say a few words at the end of the program. It is now my privilege to introduce Dr. Avital Karpman and Dr. Sharon Avni, who will discuss Reimagining the Future of Hebrew in America. Both are contributors to various research initiatives sponsored by CASG and work together on the CASG-funded study, Mapping Hebrew Education in Public Schools, a resource for Jewish educators. This and other resources can be found at casge.org. Dr. Sharon Avni is Professor of Academic Literacy and Linguistics at BMCC, Borough of Manhattan Community College at CUNY, the City University of New York. She is the co-author of Hebrew Infusion, Language and Community and American Jewish Summer Camps, and is a research affiliate with Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education at Brandeis. Her current work examines modern-day Hebraeus in the United States. Dr. Avital Karpman holds a PhD in education from York University and is the Associate Clinical Professor and Director of the Hebrew Program, School of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, and the Meyerhoff Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Maryland. Her research interests include the association between identity formation and Hebrew learning, language teacher training and curriculum development, and Hebrew learning, and then also multimodal teaching of Hebrew. She is a recent recipient of an Andrew Mellon grant to develop open source digital content for less commonly taught languages, and the author of Kisharim, a textbook for advanced learners of Hebrew. I now want to turn over the program to the engaging moderator of the Sicha series, Rabbi Andrew Ergis, who recently became CEO of Hebrew at the Center. For more than 20 years, Rabbi Ergis has held leadership roles across the spectrum of Jewish education, from Jewish camp to day school to JCCs and more. He has demonstrated his own personal passion for Hebrew, not only through his professional life and graduate work in Hebrew language and literature, but also in his personal life as the chair of the board for the past 3 years of the Council for Hebrew Language and Culture in North America. Andrew?
Arnie, thank you so much. And Sharon, Avital, it's wonderful to have you. In particular, now that we have both somebody from New York, somebody from the Canadian community, and somebody from New Jersey, it's a truly international Sicha. And Arnie, thank you for your lovely introduction and for the leadership and support that you provide as the president of Hebrew at the Center. I'd love to start us off, Sharon and Avital. Let's just start with your own personal Hebrew journey. What brought you into engagement with Hebrew? What role did Hebrew play in your life, both early on and the shift into academics? You want to start us off, Avital?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to talk with everyone today. So I grew up in the town of Winnipeg, Manitoba, right in the middle of Canada, just on the border with North Dakota and Minnesota. And there's a pretty sizable Jewish community there. So I grew up, my parents were from small towns. My mother was from a mining town way up north called Flin Flon, Manitoba. My dad is from a farm in Saskatchewan. And so moving to Winnipeg was kind of like the big city. And they were always Zionists. They moved with me when I was born. We moved to Israel and lived there for a couple of years, and then ended up coming back to Canada. And I went to Jewish day schools all my life. I went to Jewish camps, Jewish extracurricular programs, Israel trips, kind of all the things that people can do. I took advantage of that. I really felt most of my life that because I had that childhood in Israel, I kind of felt a little bit Israeli, a little bit different from my peers in Manitoba. And so I sort of thought about making Aliyah, or thought about, well, how can I incorporate this into my life? I ended up moving to Tel Aviv after college, met my boyfriend, who's now my husband, and we, you know, how these things go, ended up moving to the US. And I was thinking, well, okay, if I'm living here, how can I bring Israel kind of, it was so special to me, how can I bring it into my life while living in the US? And so I ended up enrolling in the master's program. There was a brand new master's in Hebrew pedagogy program at Brandeis that was started by Vardit Ringwald, and I was her first student. And so she, you know, we got in touch. I was interested in moving to Massachusetts. And so I trained with her for a couple of years, and then decided rather than start teaching in a school, I wanted to move on and get a PhD. So I went to York University and got a PhD in language education. And it kind of worked out really well for me, because I ended up teaching Hebrew and administering a Hebrew program at a university, and kind of being able to mix sort of the different aspects of my life. And so that's sort of my roundabout way of how I got to where I am now.
Wonderful. What about you, Sharon?
Yeah, there's a lot of parallels, actually. So I was born in a town in northern Westchester, New York, and not a lot of Jews living there. And so at a fairly young age, my mom packed me up and shipped me off to Camp Young Judea Sprout Lake, because she was a Hadassah woman. And at the time, Young Judea belonged to Hadassah. So she sent me to sleepaway camp, which I loved. And I became a very active Young Judean. And eventually, right after college, after going on their year course and spending another year in Israel throughout college, I moved to Israel. And I will have to say, I didn't really know Hebrew at the time. Something I like to tell my own students a lot is that I think I took Opan Aleph at least 8 times that I remember. It might have actually been more. I took an Opan in New York City prior to my Aliyah. I had learned Hebrew in the conservative days, the conservative religious school when I grew up, but I didn't know modern Hebrew. I took at least 4 or 5, maybe more, Opan Aleph in Israel. I took Opan Aleph at university. It was really hard for me to understand Hebrew, and it didn't really click for me until when I moved to Israel. I was living in Yokneam Elite, and I was teaching English, and someone gave me a book of the different Hebrew binyanim. It was just charts of the different structures of the verb. And the minute I got that and I understood that there's the structure, actually the language started to make sense. So I always, think that there's different ways to learn Hebrew. But at some point I did my master's at Tel Aviv University in language education, but I always wanted to be an English teacher. And I did teach English in Israel for a while, went into educational technology, teaching English on what was then CD-ROMs. At some point, like Avital, I met my husband. We came to the United States. I did a PhD at NYU, and it was at NYU that I discovered ethnography, because at Tel Aviv University, when I was a student there, it was very quantitative. I did a lot of quantitative-like studies, and I discovered ethnography at NYU, and I really, really wanted to do an ethnography. And I realized that to do a really good ethnography, you need to actually speak the language that you're studying. And I didn't have time to learn another language. And I realized I knew Hebrew. And I met with Barry Chazan, I remember at NYU at one point, he was there. And I said to him, what do you think about, my studying Hebrew? Do you think that makes any sense? And he thought it was a great idea. So I decided to do my dissertation work on Hebrew teaching and learning at a day school. And that sort of started me on my own trajectory. So I don't know if it was something that I was planning to do, and sometimes it even strikes me as kind of funny that I ended up studying Hebrew and thinking about it a lot. But that pretty much sums up my how I got to be sitting here today. And by the way, I just wanted to thank Arnie and Andrew. I forgot to say thank you for organizing this, and thanks to those of you who are joining us today. I know there's so much going on in the world right now, so thank you for carving out this hour to be with us.
Sharon, thank you. And I do want to remind everyone who's participating, at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A function. Certainly feel free to pose questions. We'll start the conversation with discourse between Sharon and Avital, but then we'll open it up to hear what participants would like to know as well. It was really interesting to hear the arc that each of you went through, both in terms of what led you to engage with Hebrew as young people, what led you to Israel. Sounds like you both came back with some more focus as to what you were going to do with your life, some stronger Hebrew skills, and with boyfriends who became husbands. So congratulations. How did the two of you meet? And when you started getting to know one another, where were the similarities that sort of attracted you to one another? And then how did you each bring something different to the mix?
Well, we were talking about it earlier, and I think it was in 2009 we first met in person. We were invited to be on a panel at AAAL, which is a conference. What does it stand for? American Association of Applied Linguistics, I think. So we were there with Ilana Shohami, who Sharon, I think, has worked with extensively. And so we were talking about some similar things that we were interested in. Before that, I had, I think, cited her in my dissertation and articles that came after that. And so I had just known her kind of on paper. So it was really exciting to meet her. And I think, a lot of what we did, especially back then, was pretty similar. I was reading her stuff when she had done her ethnography in day schools. And she was talking a lot about what the function and the purpose of studying Hebrew. So not so much about you know, the practical teaching of it, but sort of looking at groups and talking about, well, what's the significance? What does it mean? Why are these groups using Hebrew in this way and these groups are using Hebrew in this way? And what does that tell us about culture in general and Jewish culture in the US at that time? So that was similar to my first research study, which was an ethnography as well in a university classroom, where I witnessed in an advanced Hebrew class, there were students who were born in Canada and had kind of gone through the day school system and ended up in university in the advanced class. And then those who were either born in Israel or born in Russia and then, or former USSR, and then immigrated to Israel and then immigrated to Canada, but they had pretty near native fluency in Hebrew, although with, you know, Russian accent and phonetics. But those two groups were really at odds with each other, and there was a lot of conflict in the class. So in that way, it was pretty similar. Sharon, do you want to elaborate?
Yeah, I think that throughout the years, I guess it's right. Has it been already 11 years since we probably first met each other? That it's not a huge field of people who do research, academic research on Jewish education or Hebrew. I'm sorry, Hebrew education, and so it's always been really nice to know that Avital's out there and that she's working in a university and that we're in slightly different context, but that there's this person that, you know, is out there that if I have a question, if I'm thinking through something, I think she's been a really good thought partner. And we've worked on stuff together too, actual collaborations, but I think that over the years, we've been able to see each other as sort of thought partners and telling us, like, thinking through our next projects and things like that.
But you surfaced something interesting, Avital, which was this sort of Hebrew meant something different to these different groups. And I know that having read some of both your writing and Sharon's writing, I'd like help us understand, you know, sort of maybe first and foremost, how does language connect with people's identity, and in particular, how does Hebrew play different roles for different people? Big question.
Yeah. Well, when I first started looking at this particular classroom, I noticed that there was just so much tension and so much conflict. And you would think that, you know, your standard Hebrew classroom at a university, they have, you know, a widely used textbook and an Israeli teacher. And I thought, okay, how much is really going to be going on here? But there was a lot of tension there. And so I was really interested in that. I started talking to the students and teacher individually and also in focus groups. And that was different. They brought up different things in different contexts. But, you know, the ones who were sort of Russia via Israel to Canada, they called themselves the Israelis, and they called the students who were born in Canada and went through day school the Canadians. So they said, we're Israelis, they're Canadian, and everyone kind of stuck to those labels. Then the ones who were known as the Israelis, although that's debatable, were they authentic Israelis, you know, but that's what they called themselves and each other. They started to say, well, we see ourselves as more Jewish than the Canadians in the class. And so I thought, well, that's interesting, because a lot of them are pretty observant, and you are secular, you're not affiliated, but you call yourselves more Jewish than these other students in the class. So Jewish to them was equated with Hebrew fluency or Hebrew proficiency. When you really looked at the way they spoke Hebrew, there was all kinds of, you know, mistakes and slang, and it wasn't really a normative or a standard Hebrew. It was a very specific, like, to their group of friends. But they were really adamant that they were more Israeli, they were more Jewish, and the other students who were Canadian were at a disadvantage in the class because they just couldn't keep up in conversations. They did better, their grades were better because they ended up being better at grammar and accuracy, but they really felt at a disadvantage. They also talked about once they left the class, the ones who were fluent in English felt a little bit more, they were a little bit more powerful outside of the classroom and at a higher level of status because they could participate fully in Canadian discourse and, culture, while those who spoke English as a second language couldn't. So once we moved into the Hebrew classroom, the power dynamics shifted. So we saw all kinds of things like that. At one point, at that time, there were like protests, like anti-Israel stuff and Israel equal to apartheid state, like things like that going on campus. And when there were demonstrations like that, all of a sudden these two groups who were always at each other's throats really came together, and there was really the solidarity as they talked about what was going on campus. So I just noticed this flow of sometimes they were really, at odds, and sometimes they came together. So I thought it was really interesting, and maybe can tell us something about our community as a whole. And I think Sharon's work also found kind of different students and teachers interpreting Hebrew in very different ways.
Right. So I will say that over the years and the different studies I've done and the different work that I've done, it's clearer and clearer to me that talking about identity and language is a tricky thing. It's tricky because I think that most people who speak another language or have a connection with the language feel very strongly about, often feel very strongly about that language. And you'll hear lots of people say that, that's the language that they can best express themselves in. That's the language that is the most meaningful to them. And I don't reject that or question that. I think that's very legit. I just think that in many times what I found is that it's difficult to attribute knowing or learning a language to actually what someone's identity is or is going to be. Partly because it doesn't always, knowing something doesn't always mean that you're going to become a particular kind of person or use it in the ways that maybe particular educators or policymakers might want you to. So just knowing something doesn't mean that the result is clear or known. And I can give you an example. So one of the studies, so the study I did for my dissertation was at a Jewish day school, and I spent about 1.5 years with these 7th graders, and I was with them the whole 7th grade, and then I continued with them in 8th grade, and I was basically part of their school day. I was just there, and I was observing in their Hebrew classes and in some of their other classes. And I would interview them and talk with them, and I would just be there in their classroom. And what I found was that there was a lot of talk about how important Hebrew was to being Jewish. I would hear students say that they couldn't imagine a day school that didn't teach Hebrew or didn't use Hebrew. They couldn't even fathom something like that. On the other hand, when I would ask them about their own Hebrew and how they felt about learning Hebrew in the actual class, I would get very, very different responses. And so it was that tension I was always trying to figure out, that there's this ideology or belief about how important Hebrew is to being a Jew in the United States. And yet when it came to their own individual knowledge or being able to use the language, it actually wasn't that important. So I think that study was my first tip off to the fact that identity and language aren't always going to go hand in hand in anticipated ways. And I've seen that in other kinds of situations too. And it just always, it stays with me that some of the assumptions that we make about language and identity are really more complex. And that's why I love doing ethnography. That's why I love being able to go to places and hear and see not only what people are saying, but actually also what they're doing.
I see you shaking your head up and down in agreement, Avital.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking just about the different reasons someone might be motivated to if they're adults, enroll in a university class, and what I see firsthand, or if they're parents and they're enrolling their children in a Hebrew program, and it can be really surprising. So I've talked to parents who, for example, they were the founders of one of the charter schools, and they were saying, originally they wanted a Middle Eastern languages charter school. It ultimately became a Hebrew charter school, but they liked the idea of Hebrew and Arabic and Persian being very difficult languages to learn and sophisticated, and kind of have that cachet, that cool factor of, wow, my kid is learning this really hard language. So it wasn't so much about identity or Jewish identity or connection with Israel per se. I have students who enroll in my university classes who, I think for them, they have very rigorous majors in computer science or engineering or whatever, and Hebrew is kind of, it's probably an easy A for them, to be honest, but it's also a nice kind of comfortable place for them to come, where they can kind of let their guard down and relax and be with other Jewish students, perhaps, and it's kind of a nice sort of shot in the arm with that, and a nice place for them to be a few times a week. So it's not so much for them about gaining a level of proficiency to be able to go and function in the target language community, like to go make aliyah or to go communicate with Israelis necessarily. And so there's, it's endless if you talk to people, and their motivations can change from one day to the next, or from one, time of the day to the next. You never know. It's always fluctuating. So yeah, I totally agree.
I would also say that being able to do some research at a day school, and then Avital and I did work on looking at Hebrew, the programs across the United States that are teaching Hebrew in public schools, and by public schools, we find those as both traditional public schools and also charter schools. So looking at Hebrew in the day school world, looking at Hebrew in the public school world, and then in the study I just did with Sarah Ben-Or and Jonathan Krausner at Hebrew in overnight camps, I've really come to understand more and more that Hebrew really means different things to different people, and that it's important to not only just say that knowing Hebrew will result in a particular way of being Jewish, but I think I like to think of the question more as how do people use or think about or talk about Hebrew to identify themselves in particular ways. And when I frame the question in that way, at least in my own mind, it helps me to understand more about what Hebrew can mean. And sometimes it's various meanings for the same people. But for example, 2 years ago, I did a study with a colleague of mine at the CUNY Grad Center, Kate Mencken, and we looked at a program at a New York City public school that had decided to teach middle school social studies in Hebrew. So this was a public school that was teaching, ancient civilizations and the other curriculum of New York State social studies. And it was teaching that one class in Hebrew. And there was all sorts of reasons why this dual language program started, I won't go into now. And there were Jewish kids in the school, and there were non-Jewish kids. There were students who had come from yeshiva. There were some students who came from particular kinds of Christian backgrounds. And just in that one setting, Hebrew meant both a national identity, it meant opportunities for better schools, it meant to some parents and their students and their children, it meant better resources. And so there's a notion that, language can be about both pride and profit. That's not my term. That's actually Helen Duchenne talk about this, but Hebrew also it can very much be about a national or religious identity in some way, but it could also be about things that have nothing to do with that within the same classroom. And so that's always kind of interesting to peel apart and try to understand both how that is affecting the learning of the language and what the work that Hebrew is doing for these individual students and their families.
So the topic of our conversation, and to some extent part of the entire Sicha series, has really been about sort of the situation, the location of Hebrew in the community, and how we might reimagine it for the future. And I'm curious, like, I'd love to have you unpack it a little bit further, both how do we strike a balance between sort of Hebrew as symbol and then what it might mean to the actual people who engage with Hebrew? And is there something uniquely American about how this community thinks about Hebrew, both as a living language, but also as something that's symbolic?
The second part's interesting. I'll have to think about that for a little while. I think that so there's a concept in the research that I really like. It's by a scholar named Dornier, and he talks about the idealized L2 self, which L2 means second language. So basically what he's saying, instead of, in the past, they would try to sort of measure language and identity formation in these different ways, you know, using statistics and different measures. But in recent years, I really like this because it's the idea that language is one part of your idealized future self. Okay, so it could be anything. It could be running a marathon. It could be challenging yourself in some other way. It could be moving to another country or traveling. But that language is simply one part of how you see your idealized self in the future. So if you say, okay, picture yourself 5 years from now, ideally, oh, I would be this, you know, sophisticated person vacationing here and going to Israel and being able to talk to everyone. So maybe language plays a role in that. So I think it's just much larger than a simple one-to-one kind of this equals this. Yeah. So I think I was going to go somewhere else with that, but I forgot. But yeah, I think it's definitely more complex than, you know, researchers have talked about in the past.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Andrew, about how we think about what this language means and how to sort of get away from just the symbolic ideas of what the language is supposed to mean. I guess I'm thinking about the work that Sarah and Jonathan, I just mentioned them before, that we did at overnight camps. And I guess that you asked about, you know, what's specific about American Jews and their use of Hebrew? And how can we understand it as both symbolic of this community and also maybe something else? And, you know, among the many things that we found by researching Hebrew at, I think it was over 35 Jewish overnight camps, is that that Hebrew so we found Hebrew at almost every camp we went to, even when camps would tell us that they don't actually have any Hebrew. So Hebrew is a presence, at least in this summer experience, that I think it's close to 200,000 American Jewish youth go to, along with tens of thousands of Jewish staff that, you know, work at these camps. So Hebrew is alive. I mean, we often think that Hebrew isn't a part of American Jewish life. And I think our book and our work shows that it is very much alive. However, I think that we have to be careful, and we have to say, well, it's not Israeli Hebrew. And it really is its own American variety of Hebrew that's being used. So for example, you might go to a camp and you might hear sentences that's a mix of English and Hebrew, or you might hear words at a camp like mirp instead of mirpa'ah or something like that, or instead of saying harochel, they'll say hadar, or even hadar without the chet, or something like that. And no one bats an eyelash at this at camp. This is completely what we call Camp Hebraized English in the book, but it's really this variety of a language that draws from Israeli Hebrew, but it also draws from textual Hebrew. It draws sometimes from other languages too. And I think it's unapologetic, meaning that it's not saying, this isn't good enough, or this isn't a type of Hebrew that we should feel bad about. I don't think that's what camps are saying at all. In fact, camps have a lot of pride in this language that they're using and that they're always creating. And so what was interesting in our research at the camps was seeing where the tension is about other people pushing back and saying, well, actually, we don't think that that's a legitimate language, because that's not the language that's spoken in Israel. That's, you might call it whatever you want, but we're going to call it Hebrewish, or we're going to call it some sort of inferior kind of Hebrew. And we would hear this like sort of a pull and push about what is a real Hebrew, what is real Hebrew, and especially in the context of American Jewish overnight camping, what is this Hebrew? What should we be aspiring to? Is it good? Is it bad that they're using this type of Hebrew? And of course, the range among camps is quite wide. But I'm bringing this all up because I think that as American Jews, that camps are at least a place to see that Hebrew is alive. There's an incredible amount of creativity. I mean, the creativity, the way the word plays, the fun, the sort of the linguistic play that's going on at camps is really quite extraordinary. And I think that camps and we and American Jews sometimes just take it for granted, and that we shouldn't. And that's a place to see how Hebrew is being used by American Jews to do something that might not be what exactly is being done in Israel with Hebrew. That was a very long answer, so sorry about that. Can I add this book? Sorry, Avital.
Yeah,
can I add on to that? So I think as you were talking, Sharon, I was thinking about Rabbi Ergus's question about about American Hebrew, or what makes it particular to America. And I was thinking how things kind of come to a head in my classroom, as so many students who went to camps, and had this wonderful, creative, innovative experience with language, then they enroll in college Hebrew classes where I and other instructors are really kind of coming from the teaching a foreign language model and normative language, and this is what you should do, and this is accuracy, and because that's just what we do. And so students, and we have students who are coming with zero background, who are saying, well, I want to learn the verb charts, and I want to learn what's accurate, and don't want to make mistakes. And then those coming from camps who are saying, well, of course I can just throw in English here and there, I can shorten this word, I can, it's all fun, it's all great. And I say, no, that's not accurate. And so it's an issue in the classroom because they have, different standards and different philosophies coming into the class. I was thinking that, I don't know, I think that in America, it's a particularly kind of prescriptivist mentality when it comes to language. So like, you should do this. This is the correct way of saying this. And there's studies on, African-American vernacular English, and whether that's accurate or real English. Can it be taught as an actual grammar in a formal educational context? And, researchers have said it has its own grammatical structure, it has its own norms, it's very systematic. And when I see my students in Hebrew classes coming from that Jewish camp background, many years of Jewish camping, it's like, it's a really systematic way of speaking Hebrew in their own way, you know? So they'll use kind of Hebrew syntax, but their nouns will be in English. So it's like, Basummer halachti lelake im ha, you know, boyfriend shali, you know, so it's like in this very systematic way. And no matter what state they're coming from, or whether it was 10 years ago or today, like it's consistent. So it's a real grammar that's being created. But you have this pushback from language instructors who are coming at it from this different perspective and saying, well, we need to focus on the normative and the accuracy and the, you know, so it's an interesting point. But I just wanted to say that it is highly systematic, I think. And yeah, that it's very kind of American, I think, to judge whether a language is right or wrong or better or worse. And Hebrew falls into that as well.
So first of all, I want to remind our participants, you can post questions. In a moment, we'll be turning to some of the participant questions. But what you just said, Avital, really led me to think about, it's not just Americans who have this sort of prescriptive approach to language. There's the Academy of Hebrew Language, which even within the Israeli culture takes a very strong stance on what is and isn't legitimate Hebrew. And certainly as English makes its way into the Israeli vernacular, there's a struggle there. I mean, the French have the same thing, which may be something with your Canadian background, although from a different part of Canada, certainly played itself out. And I'm curious, we've had a few questions over the last number of Sichot. There's sort of the Israelis, there's the Americans, and then there are the Israeli Americans. And in many cases, Israeli Americans are making up a significant percentage of instructors of Hebrew in this country. Like, who owns this thing called Hebrew? Or does language not really have an owner?
Sharon, do you want to take it first?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, this is something that I'm, currently thinking about a lot in my own work, because I'm trying to understand, in a broader sense, what it means to feel a connection to Hebrew when in a country like the United States, where you don't need to use modern Hebrew for the most part. I mean, for work and for most things, you don't necessarily, it's not a big language in the United States. There's not, millions of speakers or something like that. And so more recently, I've been thinking about, how do we think about what it means to claim a language as your own, even if you are not necessarily a so-called native speaker, or you don't have highly proficient use of the language. And I mean, that's really a question that I'm, very currently really working on and trying to understand, how we understand where those borders are, like sort of who sets the borders, first of all, who has the authority to set these borders about what is or what is not Hebrew in the United States. And then, listening to people who are invested in the language, who claim it as something that's part of them, and understanding for themselves what that means. And sometimes I think it's a very personal thing. So we often think about Hebrew as being this, like, the national language of the Jews, and it's the Jewish people, and it's our linguistic glue, and it's peoplehood, and all these sort of big terms. And when I talk to people, sometimes it's a really personal personal thing that, and they're not bringing up these sort of, big concepts. Sometimes it's a personal puzzle that someone's trying to solve. And that's what's attracting them to the language. And so it is really complicated, this question of who owns a language. I mean, obviously no one owns a language. It's more about, who we give permission to say they own it, or who give permission to say that it's yours or not. Avital, I'm going to pass this on to you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And it depends on the context. It depends, is it a group of yeshiva students in a particular geographic location who are using their own variety of Hebrew? Is it Camp Hebrew? Is it, and those are all different as well. It's not like a one thing. I was thinking that, language is, you can study Hebrew on your own. You can read literature, you can study the grammar, you can do it by yourself. But as soon as you are using it in speaking and communication, in writing or speaking, it's inherently social and interactive, and it's a dialogue between you and another person. So when you have that dialogue, that's when all of this negotiation comes into play. So it depends, there's different levels of power structures, as I mentioned before. Many of us, I think, who are native English speakers who go to Israel have probably encountered, trying to speak Hebrew to Israelis, and they immediately switch to English with you. And there's kind of this weird power dynamic thing saying, no, I can speak Hebrew, don't switch to English with me, And so you start to think it gets really psychological, and you think about, well, are you saying this is more your language than my language? I can hold my own, And so it becomes this kind of negotiation where power structures are involved sometimes. And it's like that in any conversation, even when you're speaking in English with, your professor versus your 3-year-old niece or something, there's a lot of that going on, different relationships and the way you change your language and your tone. But it's because it's dialogue is what we're talking about. It changes significantly based on whatever setting you're talking about. So
to be completely transparent, Avital, when I first encountered some of your writing, you were writing with a different last name. And I was reading your material at the same time as I was reading Sharon's, but I thought I was reading Sharon Avni and Avital Fur. And I thought, oh, here are these two Israelis who write such beautiful English. I'm curious, David Peters, one of our participants, he would be interested in hearing you speak Hebrew. I don't know that he's really asking for you to present in Hebrew, but he's wondering if you, as what he calls Anglo-Saxon, the kind of barriers that you have to overcome when you are walking around with at least first names that could easily be, you could pass yourself off as native born. What's that encounter like when you're wrestling over your Hebrew and your language resources versus somebody says, no, this is my language?
I get to the moment I open my mouth and start speaking Hebrew, nobody's going to say, oh, you were born and raised in Tel Aviv or something like that. And I give a lot of credit to my friends and family in Israel or here that have listened to me speak Hebrew endlessly, in conversation or something like that. I don't have a very strong American accent, but I have an American accent. And I'm also a little obsessive about making sure I'm using the right, like, is it Zacha and Akiva? I'll stop a conversation and say, wait, what's that word? And how do you use it? And that kind of stuff. And so I appreciate people having the patience to sort of everything as a meta conversation with me when I'm speaking Hebrew. But I will say that in the beginning, I was very intimidated by not being a native speaker of Hebrew and studying Hebrew use. It seems almost, it's quite a paradox. And there are sometimes words that I don't know, and I will go home and learn them or something like that. And I don't feel like sometimes I can express myself maybe as well as I want. For sure, my Hebrew was better 20 years ago when I lived in Israel. But I will say that more and more over the years, I've come to realize, I've come to sort of step back from that and realize that that's just the state of language in the world, and that there's so many people speaking in language in which they didn't grow up. And I worked really, really hard to acquire the Hebrew that I do have. And I think sometimes, my mistakes make people laugh. I think can be a joyful conversation when someone is just trying and stuff like that. And so I've taken more and more of the position of just, I just get up and I speak. I understand the sense that, I'm making a mistake, and if I'm getting really excited about a conversation or something like that, there's probably going to be more, errors. But I think I'm understood, and yeah, but I appreciate the question that the person asked, because I think sometimes it can be a barrier. Sometimes I don't think people take me as seriously academically, things like that. But I'm not sure really what I can do about that. I work on my Hebrew and that kind of thing. But I don't know. I'd be curious to hear what Avital says, because I know that her Hebrew is slightly different from mine. So, Avital, what?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I'm sure you have the same experience that when you're in these interactions, you're thinking about all these research constructs and these terms, and you say, oh, this is happening here, and this is so you have a million things kind of going on in your mind at once, and it's not just about the words coming out. But yeah, it's the same with me. I was a little bit self-conscious when I first started out, and especially, presenting at conferences or going to Israel, you'd worry, and I would really worry about, my resh sound, and if I was, because I sort of fake it. And then someone told me, a roommate of mine said, that's not what makes you sound non-Israeli, it's your tet. You have you say Avital, it's like a TS almost, like a heavier tet than Avital, like it's not that staccato sound. And I said, really? I never would have realized that. So it was something I didn't even know. But yeah, I think just with everything, as you get older, you get more, you're not as self-conscious about it. You don't worry about it. You're focusing on the content of what you actually have to say. And if someone has a problem with, your accent or making a mistake or using a word in English, that's kind of, there's no right way of speaking. Someone in the US, who has a Spanish accent or inflections in their speech, it doesn't make it any less American. It's a language that's spoken in the US. So it's, these languages are what they are. So I'm not too concerned about it anymore.
Thank you. First of all, both, thank you for responding to the question, but also sort of sharing some of the places where you have some vulnerabilities around your Hebrew. I certainly appreciate that myself. Both Lawrence Grossman and Rachel Sternheim asked sort of questions that really kind of overlap, and they're really about, what might we do here in terms of Hebrew education in America? Does it need to be broader than just what's going on in our schooling setting? And why would it even be important to engage in Hebrew education here in America? And, in particular, most native speakers of Hebrew also have English language skills. Most Hebrew texts have been translated. Even Fauda has subtitles. So where might we focus it, and why is it even important?
I mean, I think that as we've talked about, Hebrew means different things to different people. If we're talking about the Jewish community and Jewish continuity, there are certainly people who get very inspired to be more Jewish, to continue to raise their children as Jewish, you know, join Jewish cultural things and observe. And Hebrew, you know, is what inspires them. It's not everyone, but you know, there are some people who are inspired by that, and so that's important. I think for me, what connects me to Hebrew is really the language itself, the structure of the language, the history of how it was revived and how words are formed. I'm just tickled by so many things when I, you know, come across a word that's just so creative and has so much kind of humor behind it. So it means different things to different people, and if it can inspire someone in some way, whether it is to feel closer to Israel, to be more part of a community, even just not related to Israel or Judaism, it might just be something for their own self-esteem. I love the language, so that's why I'm always, you know, advocating for it, and I see myself as a Hebraist, and yeah.
And I think it's a really complicated question that you asked, Andrew, but I would say I don't want to also, I mean, the vast majority of American Jewish children, young adults, are learning Hebrew in religious schools. And I know that they often get a bad, name for, you know, for not teaching modern Hebrew, for not teaching Israeli Hebrew. But yet, you know, there's a lot of Hebrew being learned in religious schools across the United States. And I think just like any subject or anything like that, some of it is really good and some of it is less good perhaps. But I don't, you know, so I think that if modern Hebrew is going to have relevance to the American Jewish community, it's figuring out what that is, and it's probably going to look really different in many different contexts. But I think that we still have to remember that there is this other variety of Hebrew that is being taught, and lots of creativities. I'm on lots of, you know, Facebook things and with Hebrew teachers, and then looking for always ways to improve. And so I think that, and to learn from each other. And I think that, you know, we have to commend that effort. I will say, you know, I kind of poo-pooed it, and I was so negative about my own children's learning of Hebrew in the religious schools that they've gone to. And then at one point, just recently in the past few years, I've come to realize that that wasn't really fair, and that my children are a little different because we speak Hebrew at home, but not always. But in any event, you know, when I saw that they knew this language, they knew this other alphabet, they could read it and stuff like that, and it's not always with understanding, right? They weren't picking up a book. But I guess this is a long way of saying that they took a lot of pride in that. And so I always like to remember that there is this context that is always working to make it better and to make it more meaningful, and always trying to figure out what that connection is.
So you're going to get an opportunity here, Sharon, to plug your book. Alicia Gedjman, I hope I got your last name correct, actually wanted to know the name of your book. And
Can I show
I
it?
know that it just rolled off the presses in the last couple of weeks, but also in relationship to the book, Nechama Moskowitz asks a really interesting question. And, you know, I think at the heart of it is it sufficient for us to kind of celebrate these different varieties of Hebrew, in particular kind of the camp Hebrew, which is far away from the binyanim and structure that you were studying many years ago? Or is there a pathway in those settings, whether it's camp or whether it's kind of the fun things that are happening maybe in Hebrew school programs that lead students further down the path towards a deeper sense of owning Hebrew, of Hebrew acquisition?
Well, thank you, Elisa. Elisa was, I think, who asked the question. Thank you. I love to plug this book, but it really did just come out. It's sitting on my desk. I'm so tempted to lift it up, but I won't. But it's called Hebrew Infusion, Language and Community in American Jewish Summer Camps. And it basically is the historical and contemporary story of Hebrew at American Jewish overnight camps. To answer Nahama's question about should we be celebrating this, I guess I would answer it like this, Nahama, and I'm so glad you asked the question, is that, I mean, I think ideally it would be nice if these contexts weren't so isolated. And maybe if we could start thinking about, like, these are the same kids. And if we saw things maybe over context, or, you know, intercontext and over lifespan. So it's the same child who might go to religious school and then go to some kind of other Jewish event and go to camp in the summer. It's that same child who might ultimately do some other things as they get older and they become college students, and then they become adults. And so I think that, you know, if we can start seeing things maybe more in a more holistic way, it could be helpful. Because I know when I did go to Israel, and we actually start our book with a tale of a comedian, Benji Lovett, talking about he learned all this camp Hebrew, and when he went to Israel, people would say, like, oh, do you know Hebrew? And he would use his camp Hebrew, and it was, you know, it's a story I can't really do justice to it right now, but the notion that I don't think these things are so separate, and it would be nice to think about ways in which we could think about the religious school setting as an opportunity to think about what the kinds of Hebrew work is happening in camps and in other settings. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's something I think about.
Efrat Gafni actually is wondering, should Camp Hebrew or American Modern Hebrew, should it be influencing and impacting what Efrat's calling official Hebrew? I'm presuming that's sort of the standard variety that's emerging from the academic, the Academy of Hebrew Language.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you say it?
Should Camp Hebrew be one of the influencers? I mean, I'm wondering, there's not this coming summer, but in most summers, there's 1,500 to 2,000 young Israelis who immerse themselves in these Camp Hebrew environments. Are they bringing any of this Hebrew, Camp Hebrew variety into sort of mainstream secular Israeli vernacular?
Yes. So, one, and my co-author Sarah Benar is texting me, telling me I have to hold up the book. So, Sarah, I think that yes. So, one of the things we look at is actually Israeli shlichim, and other Israeli staff, both at camp, how they come to understand themselves vis-a-vis the kind of Hebrew that's being used at camp, recognizing that it's not Israeli Hebrew, and that in some ways they need to kind of jump on the bandwagon. They can't, that this language is powerful in the context it's being spoken. And I think that some of it does return with them to Israel. And I'm sure when they're talking about camp or their experience in the United States, they might be using these words. But I think more important than maybe the actual words is they have a better sense of what American Jewish life, American Jewish culture is as it is constructed and lived, at least in camp. Because camp is obviously not, it has its own culture, but it's obviously slightly different also from what goes on in contexts which are not camp. But I do think that Israelis go home with a strong sense, sometimes it's a religious sense that they want to know more about Judaism, but I think it's a way of understanding American Jews better. And I think that's really important.
So I'm going to give you one last question, and if you could use this as a opportunity to kind of reflect on the conversation we've had before. And there's a lot of other wonderful questions that have been surfaced that we'll be happy to share with you. But Hannah Kober is really kind of interested in like where's the research going? She uses the term the black boxes. Like, what do we not know? What are we going to need to ask? What are the questions people send to you? What are the questions you yourselves have when you think about where is Hebrew going to go in this community?
I can start. So I, in recent years, my focus has really been as a practitioner and as a program administrator. I'm kind of really looking at kind of on the ground, bottom up, what to do in an applied or practical sense. And I think that's why Sharon and I work so nicely together, is because I think, Sharon, you often come in as the ethnographer, and I, most of my energies day to day are spent in the classroom and teaching and assessing students and things like that. So for me, I'll just come at it as a practitioner and what I think needs to happen in the classroom and what we need to research in the classroom. I think there's a huge lack of materials and lack of resources across Hebrew educational contexts. I think much more needs to be created for teachers who are just having such a hard time just creating lesson plans and curricula. So that's really important. I think just sort of getting Hebrew, it's sort of, decades behind at this point when you compare it to Spanish and French and English as a second language, just in terms of teaching methods, in terms of assessment techniques. It's really hard to sort of bring everyone along and into the modern kind of foreign language teaching system. So that's one thing. I've been lately really fascinated by kind of smaller communities and sort of not unconventional or non-standard learning settings. So, in conversations I've had with people who have Hebrew programs in very small communities in like college towns, and, I have a contact in Alabama or in, different small places across America, homeschoolers who are really taking a lot of initiative in teaching their children on their own, or just forming small groups that kind of pop up and they're trying to teach Hebrew in their own way. I'm interested in how different curricula are being used and differentiated learning that happens with the same textbook or the same curriculum. How can we use that in both a religious school setting and a day school setting, and and a homeschooling setting, for example? So there are different kind of innovations going on in these sort of non-conventional settings. So not in Jewish day schools, not in summer camps, but sort of smaller places. I think that our research is so like East Coast centric or coast centric, I would say. And so we often don't spend a lot of energy looking at what's happening in, communities in the Midwest or in the middle of the country that, don't get as much attention in terms of funding and programming. And they're doing a lot with a little, they're really being innovated with very few resources and staffing issues. So I think we can learn a lot from these kind of unconventional communities. That's where I'm looking.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, Avital and I, sometimes we talk about, we want to do a project where we just identify all the different Hebrew teaching learning contexts that are out there and all the different initiatives, and whether they're just a small little thing or whether it's being, a highly fun kind of initiative, because there is so much actually going on, but it's because it's not centralized in any way currently that it people don't necessarily know, and I'm constantly learning about new things. I'll read something and say, oh my gosh, I didn't even know that existed. And so I think that's both, that's actually, it's exciting, but, and it's great. so it would be nice, I think that there's lots of black boxes. It's sort of, sometimes it's identifying that there's a black box and then even knowing what the black box is, if that makes sense. But I think that when we think about, sort of understanding what's going on with Hebrew in the United States, there's so much opportunity to study it, meaning there is so much going on. And so I guess my plug would just be to, have people join us in this effort to do it, because there's different questions that, obviously someone's training, the different kinds of questions you ask are going to yield different kinds of results that could be of use to different kinds of groups. And so you need all these different things. I guess, that's my call for people to join in studying this.
Sharon Avital, I can't thank you enough, not only for joining us in this conversation and fielding these different questions that I had, that our participants had, but also for putting in the time, your commitment, your passion, your intellectual resources to help open up a lot of these questions and to kind of move us forward in such a thoughtful and deep way. I also want to thank all the participants again. As Arnie said at the beginning of the conversation, we'll be following up this Sicha series with a survey to literally the hundreds of people who've joined us in these conversations. We'd love to hear some more from you. What other questions do you have, and where might we go with this program and with other programs to create a platform to expand the conversation and to include more people in this? And finally, we're going to heed your call, Sharon. One of the things that's exciting to us to be doing this with CASG is that Hebrew at the Center, which focuses fairly extensively on practitioners, I'm sort of responding to some of the things Avital talked about in terms of material, helping teachers develop curriculum that are authentic to their own classrooms, to their own environments, but help move the second language acquisition agenda forward and brings the Hebrew conversation up to date, is incredibly important to us, but we know we can't do it alone. And we're very excited to be partnering with CASG, not only on today's program, but in some of the unfolding conversations that we've had about how we bring together researchers like you, the research agenda, and the needs of the field. So with that, it's really my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Ariel Levitas. She's the director at CASG. She'll bring this evening's wonderful Sicha to a conclusion. Ariel? Ariel, we don't hear you.
How about now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So I have the honor of bringing this Sicha to a close. Thank you again to our panelists, Dr. Sharon Avni and Dr. Avital Karpman, to the facilitator tonight, Rabbi Andrew Ergis. Thank you to Arnie Winchell and Hebrew at the Center for having organized this very stimulating discussion. And thank you to all of the questions, which were fantastic. A very lively audience. Ariel Levitas, Managing Director of CASG, the Consortium for Applied Studies in Jewish Education. We're housed at George Washington University. And our mission is to improve the quality of knowledge available to guide Jewish education, practice, and policy. And since our founding, Hebrew language education has been a key area of focus for CASG. And so to that end, I would encourage you to visit our webpage, casg.org. You'll find a number of studies and literature reviews that we've published on Hebrew language education. You'll find a link, I think, to this new forthcoming book that Sharon plugged a little bit earlier, that was seeded in part by CASG funding, Hebrew Infusion. This summer, we'll be releasing a new CASG report by Dr. Sarah Benor, Dr. Netta Avineri, and Rabbi Nikki Greninger about Hebrew language education in Jewish part-time schools, which I think will be of great interest to this audience. And I think I can't say goodnight without acknowledging that there's a lot going on in our country right now and a lot of pain and unrest. And I think we all know that language can be a tool of violence and of peace. So I hope we can just end with the wish that we all choose our words at this time to build peace, trust, community. And I want to say, and I'm a little self-conscious of my Hebrew, so I hope I picked the right phrase, but tishmor al atzmechem, that we all take good care of ourselves right now and of each other. Thank you again for joining us. And check out the website, both for CASG and Hebrew at the Center, for more ways to get involved. Thank you.
Ariel, toda rabba lach, and also a special toda to Alicia Post, who's been working on the back end and helped us make not only tonight's Sicha conversation so rich, but the other three as well. So Laila Tov to everyone. We look forward to seeing you in our next series when that unfolds in the future. Bye-bye.